Now it's the first Monday in the job for EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and indeed Council President Charles Michel. The pair have promised to lead the EU towards a more assertive position on the world stage and to make the bloc carbon neutral by 2050. But they will also have to take time negotiating Brexit, and then there's still more migrants arriving into the EU with still no united plan in place to deal with that. So how solid is the bloc, and what's the future likely to bring? Well, to give us her perspective, we're joined by Professor of International Relations at Oxford University, a Franco-Greek author with some German and Spanish origins, and now I believe also British nationality, Ms. Kalypso Nicolaïdis. Welcome to the show. Can I start by asking you, actually, what do you think of this message from the new presidents of these EU institutions that the EU needs to step up and take a stronger role on the world stage?
Well, this is a message that I think many welcome, given the fact that the world is a mess and the world needs the EU. That's what we all believe. And it's nice to see that the Commission is committed to the big topics that will give Europe more of a voice and continue to do so on climate, and especially on climate. But the question is, does it have the capacity to do this? And will the member states work together and understand that the EU is not there to replace them, but to enhance, to magnify their own national powers?
Indeed, that's a lot of the gripe a lot of nations have, is the influence Brussels has and how they work in tandem rather than in place of each other. How do you think Brexit has affected, how the EU's role is seen?
Well, negatively to start with. You lose one of the biggest member states who has the biggest contribution to Europe's military and intervention capacity. That's not going to be good news. And it also makes the EU less credible as an entity that can somehow make its member states happy. But on the other hand, some believe in Brussels, I don't agree, that it will give the EU more coherence, more unity in the international stage. I don't know. When you have to have sanctions, you need the UK. When you intervene, you need the UK. On climate change, you need the UK. So my hope is that actually the world will start to understand that the UK and the rest of Europe, the EU, the remaining 27 in the EU, will continue to work very closely together.
Yeah, indeed. A lot will come down into that future relationship and how close it is. But you have wrote a book on Brexit recently. It uses Greek myths and biblical myths to examine the fallout from Brexit. It's called Exodus, Reckoning, Sacrifice, the three meanings of Brexit. Tell us a bit more about that, and indeed why you used Greek and ancient myths to talk about it.
Well, I have Greek mythology a bit in my DNA, being brought up by a Greek father in Paris who's always telling me the stories. But I think we all do, in some way or another, refer to these stories, these great archetypes. And I came to see that there were stories that people had in their mind to understand Brexit. What does it really mean beyond the nitty-gritty of regulatory negotiations? And I started to see that perhaps we can have a better democratic conversation if we appeal to these myths, to understand that, Exodus is about a yearning of a people to be free, whether they're right or wrong. Reckoning is about Europe facing some terrible truth, like Oedipus did when he stabbed his eyes. And sacrifice is a temptation humans always have, to put a country, a group, a person on the altar. In this case, perhaps the altar of European unity, as we were talking about a moment ago.
Now, you also evoked the idea that the EU needs to change its perspective on many things, looking not so much at rather at space of the European Union, but as time to find peace.
Yes, in the book I call for a pivot in Europe from the politics of space, free movement and all that, to the politics of time. Let's not abandon space. I mean, we do need to continue on that front, but most importantly, the EU needs to become the guardian of the long term. It's really bad at short-term democracy. We all know this. That's why there is Brexit. The Brits were, I think, rightly concerned by the lack of democracy in the EU, or at least a democracy they can understand. So this is why I believe that this pivot from the politics of space to the politics of time would help the EU recover a certain kind of legitimacy as a democracy with foresight, a long-term democracy.
At the same time, they're facing so many immediate emergencies. Like when you look at the migrant crisis that has been going on for many years now, declared an emergency back in 2015, and they still have struggled to come up with any united path forward. And that's a very crucial one. We need a short-term answer.
Well, indeed, Eve, but haven't you been covering this dossier for years? And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is if we had addressed the migrant crisis with foresight, years back, working on circular migration, working together with the countries from which these migrants originate, maybe we wouldn't be where we are. And so we need to have a conversation among all citizens of Europe and the media to think about, well, how do you not always only react on the short term, which you need to do, but always put forward politics for the long term?
Do you think that that would lead to a more unity in the European Union? Because indeed on the Brexit question, we have seen the other 27 actually stay very much on the same page in their unity as how they want to move forward. But on a lot of other issues, on the economy, on migration, on taxes, we see very different levels between the various countries in that bloc.
Indeed, and there will never be, absolute harmony. That's just a kind of philosophical utopia. But there will be more unity if countries can engage their citizens and their citizens work together, talk together across borders, to think together, who's going to pay in the short term if we think about the long term, and how do we compensate them? These are very big questions. They're not easy questions. But yes, I think Europe can be more united if it becomes devoted to sustainable integration.
Yeah, working as a team. And what do you make, because there was also on that term of integration, von der Leyen, the new president of the region, she's open to further expansion. Do you think that that's a good idea, or are we already at the limit of where the EU can go?
Well, certainly on this one, I'm with the 26 against France and Macron, President Macron, in believing that we first need to settle everything internally before we get engaged into enlargement. He's right to say that we need to do enlargement with more foresight, better, yes, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't start. And specifically with North Macedonia, this is, the Balkan equivalent of Franco-German reconciliation. It's a huge thing. And we're running a huge risk in Europe by keeping them for the moment at bay and not really delivering the promise that we made when they made this big jump and big agreement with Greece on their very name as a country, and I speak here as a Greek, to applaud the result of these negotiations and to say that France, be the leader that you can be, and go to the Balkans and go to there and say, we are with you in looking for all sorts of ways of reconciling between countries.
Indeed, and as you say, when you start thinking of that wider long-term goal, that might indeed help change people's perspectives. Kalypso Nicolaïdis, thanks so much for coming in. And if anybody wants a unique look at this Brexit scenario, Exodus, Reckoning and Sacrifice is out now. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.